Good evening. Welcome to our Wednesday night Bible class. Oh, I like summer, but sometimes I get up here on a Wednesday and think we need to get school started so everyone gets back in town and stops leaving all the time. But we've got a lot of people out tonight. A couple, though, are not here for health reasons, of course. You'll notice Scott was not here Sunday and continues to stay at home. For a second time, he had to get his nose cauterized, which that sounds about exactly as good as you think it would be. And Mirthaline told me he's feeling very sore, and of course, you know, your nose is very close to your vocal cords, and so when you talk, it can irritate that, and I think if he were here, he wouldn't resist being able to talk, and that would make things worse, and so he's home tonight. Again, having problems with the blood thinners, been having some nosebleeds. They aren't causing the nosebleeds, but when you're on blood thinners, you don't clot very well, so it's become a big, what normally would be a small issue, like a nosebleed, has become a big issue for him, and hopefully they can get that figured out so this doesn't continue to be a problem. Let's see, Stan let me know that Susan Dilbeck, she had her surgery, was it today you said? Yesterday, okay. She's home recovering. It went well, but of course that was a pretty significant surgery, so she's recovering, and we want to continue to pray throughout the recovery, but we're glad to hear that the surgery went as well as could be expected, if I understood that right. And of course, we just want to remember particularly the announcements on the back of the bulletin that are highlighted in blue as the most current or new information. I circled on there because I saw on Facebook, I can't remember if it was today or yesterday, but we've been praying for Cammie Bradford. That is Peggy's granddaughter, John's niece. Back in Texas. She's been in the hospital and looks like she was back in the hospital again with some liver issues and fluid buildup, and just been a rough go. Let's keep praying for the Bradford family. That's really all I've got for announcements, unless the elders have anything else we need to bring to the church's attention right now. If not, call in 322. We'll sing 322 in just a moment, but first we've got the invitation that has been prepared by Jim tonight.
Evening. Sunday afternoon, Jay Dial talked to me and he said, "Jim, time is your enemy." And I guess he meant I need to keep the invitation shorter. So he said 3 minutes. So I threw 27 minutes away off of my invitation, and I think I can do it. But that's the title of tonight's message, is time's our enemy. Because we view time as if we have a lot of it. We don't view time as if, I could die in the next minute. We think about next week, next year, what am I going to do? And there's nothing wrong with that as long as you're redeeming the time that you do have now in the right way. You can't just skate by. And so we need to think about time in the sense that we're not given a set amount of time. It's limited. Satan may convince you that, hey, you don't need to repent today. You don't need to be baptized today. You got tomorrow. You got next week. Wait till your friend does it. Wait till your wife's there. Wait till your friends are there. But the reality is, and we see it on the news every day, people die suddenly and tragically, such as the fires in Hawaii. Such as the young people that I've been reading about the last 3 or 4 weeks, 17, 18-year-old kids playing basketball or football are dying on the fields. They didn't plan it, but it happened. So the question is, for us tonight, as Christians, and maybe those who want to be Christians, is, what am I doing with my time? Have I redeemed the time I have wisely? I would like us to look at one passage in Luke chapter 12 and verse 20. And what it says there, it's right in the middle of a parable, but it says, "But God said to him, 'You fool, this night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared?'" I mean, that's pretty sobering, right? If I think about today as if it's my last day, have I prepared for what's ahead? Have I looked forward to knowing that, hey, I've got to answer to God? So if you're a Christian, the question for you is, how have you prepared? Have you walked the walk? Have you talked the talk? Have you thought the thoughts? I mean, when you look at this parable, he was just thinking in his own mind. He hadn't even done anything yet. But God said, hey, your soul's required of you tonight. If you're not a Christian, have you thought about the consequences of your unbelief? Because essentially that's what it is. Most people grow up in the church. I didn't, so I didn't have the opportunity to hear it every day. But as children and teenagers, you hear about being a child of God all the time. You know what you need to do, and if you don't, you have an adult or another friend that might know, that can tell you that you need to believe that Jesus Christ is God's Son, and you need to confess him and be baptized for the remission of your sins. See, time's our enemy, whether we're unsaved or whether we're saved. Are we redeeming it? Are we doing what we need to do to maintain our place in heaven? If there's a need for prayers or you need to be baptized tonight, won't you come forward as we stand and sing the song of invitation?
Bring Christ your broken life, so long I sin. He will create anew, make whole again. Your empty, wasted years, he will restore, and your iniquities remember.
Please bow with me. Dear and holy, merciful Lord, thank you for this wonderful world which you have blessed us with. Thank you for letting us come together to worship and praise you, and we hope that all that you witness here this evening is pleasing unto you, and we ask that you be with the sick and those in need. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right, let's open in our Bibles to Genesis chapter 6. Don't know why this is always thought of as a child's story. It's definitely made for adults, and it's something we can learn from. We're going to talk about the flood today. Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9. And you'll notice that Genesis chapter 6 and verse 9 is the beginning of a new section of this book. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 9 says, "This is the genealogy of Noah." So we start our new section after we get to the beginning of chapter 6, which introduces the flood and the sinful conditions of life on earth. We begin this new section for the next 4 chapters, focusing in on the life of Noah before we begin the generations of Terah. Well, it says that, but really we're looking at Abraham at that point. That's our next section. So we begin a new section of Genesis tonight when we get to verse 9. But prior to that, let's finish up our discussion on these first 8 verses in Genesis chapter 6. It talks about this, and I'm not going to go back to sons of God, daughters of men. We could spend 2 hours talking about that and still come away from class saying, but we still don't know what it exactly is saying. The point, though, is we can see this downward trajectory, and that's what we need to hold on to in Genesis. For all the questions that might remain or linger in our mind, we need to hold on to what's the message. That is unmistakable. God made a good world, and mankind has chosen sin. And it gets worse. Cain murders. Lamech murders even more and brags about it. And now we get to Genesis chapter 6, and we get to this shocking condition here when it says in Genesis 6 and verse 5 that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's a lot of absolutes. That's a lot of only evil continually. Every thought of his heart. So it just may be a little bit of hyperbole, but if you think the world is bad today, I don't think it's at this point. There are still good people in the world. There's a lot of evil that goes on, but there's still good people in the world. And you just couldn't find that in the days of Noah. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, "I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them." And that could be the end of the Bible right there. In some ways, it probably should be. Because the next verse says that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So the question I want you to ponder is, how was Noah saved? What saved Noah? We'll come back to that after we look through chapter 6, but I want you to ponder that question and think about some possible answers. But we're told right up front that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. What are some implications of the fact that Noah found grace? What does this tell us about Noah? He had a good heart. And we do read about that at the end, chapter 6 and verse 22, that Noah did according to all that God commanded him. He certainly was different than the rest of the world. He was a different nature. He followed God, walked with God, and listened to God. And so there's a reason why he found grace in the eyes of the Lord, but let's dig a little deeper. What else does grace imply? Faith and favor. Yeah, both are true. And that's what grace literally is favor. It is simply kindness, favor, giving. And we usually add to that the idea of undeserved favor. That's what grace is. So yes, God shows him mercy. God shows him, here's a way that you can be saved from this punishment. But if it's undeserved, well, does that not also tell us something about Noah? If we are going to look at this from the angle of deserved, well, Noah certainly stood apart from the rest of the world. he didn't deserve to be saved either. Was he perfect? Was he flawless? No. The simple truth is, God gave him a choice, and he chose to follow it. Do you think that God would have rejected anyone else in the entire world that would have genuinely repented? Do you think God would have said, there's no room for you on this boat? Do you think God limited his grace to only Noah, and he would never have considered anybody else? No. What set Noah apart, yes, he was of a better character, and he did listen to God, but he was not sinless, he was not deserving. If we're talking about deserving, he should have drowned with everybody else. But the reality is, God showed him grace. He found grace in the eyes of the Lord. That implies that he was not deserving of it, but God gave it to him anyway. And that's the thing that I like to focus on. I don't know if you've encountered this, but I hear this quite often, especially from friends or past acquaintances that were Christian but are not anymore. And this is some of their complaints. The God of the Bible is just too cruel for my taste. Or, at a pro-life march, and someone was holding a sign that says God is pro-life and said, well, didn't God kill everyone in the world? And the guy was speechless. Well, there's some answers to that. First of all, God is God. One person killing another person is wrong. The Creator who gave us life has the right to take that life away when he deems it necessary. There's your obvious answer. So the guy being dumbfounded was inexcusable. But that is something people like to accuse God, that look at all the people he killed. He killed probably millions of people, at least thousands of people in Genesis chapter 6. How could you love a God like that? You're focusing on the wrong side. How could God be so merciful and so patient to say, you know what? Maybe I got 1 million people, I got a couple million people. I don't know how many people are in the world at this time, but I got thousands and thousands over here that are just irredeemably wicked. Over here, I got this one guy. He's got a wife and kids. I'll let them, they're kind of like him. I'll let them pass too. So I got 8 people over here. And I'm looking at this equation and I'm just thinking, it's not worth it. If we're being rational, 8 people, it's not worth it. Why go through all of this? Because that's who God is. Because when somebody was willing to listen to God and follow God's voice, God would show mercy. So rather than focus on all the lives that were lost, we need to remember, first of all, that they were lost because man was, every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, and there was violence on the earth. It filled the earth. That's why they were lost. And second of all, we need to focus on the grace of God here. The grace of God shown to undeserving man, even someone like Noah. Yes?
The thing is, too, is God obviously knew the outcome of this scenario, how many people were going to be on the ark, but yet he still had Noah preach.
Yeah.
Noah preached to those people. They made the choice to refuse God's word. So,
Yeah. Peter refers to him as a preacher of righteousness.
it was their option. They chose the wrong side.
Yeah. And so that's what we see here throughout all of this. Adam and Eve sinned, and God made garments for them, and God helped them out and said, you will surely die the day you eat of this, but he didn't actually kill them that day. There were consequences, but there was also mercy. Cain kills Abel, and Cain, the ground will be cursed, and you won't be able to grow anything anymore. Oh God, this is too great a punishment. Cain, you killed your brother. You should be grateful I didn't kill you. But that's not how God responds. He says, okay, I'll put a mark on you. No one will touch you. There's grace. There's consequences. God measures out the judgment and the consequences, but still there is grace. And we see that here with the flood. The whole world, save for 8 people, is completely irredeemably lost. And these 8 people aren't perfect either. But we see the mercy of God more than we see the anger of God. That is his nature, but mankind, as John rightly pointed out, mankind is rejecting this. God would have made plenty of room on the boat. And I think too, if God would have spared Sodom and Gomorrah for just 10 righteous people, I think he would have halted the flood if there was a few more people like Noah. Probably didn't even need that many. We see God's mercy. So that's what we want to emphasize here. So, and we also emphasize in verse 6 that the Lord was grieved in his heart, that this pained him to see this. This is not, when he made man in his image, this is not what he intended for them to become. All right, any questions on the first 8 verses in Genesis chapter 6 that sets up the flood? The earth was full of wickedness and violence, and every intent of their thought was only evil continually. This is as bad as you could get. So now we get the genealogy of Noah. And it says in verse 9 that Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. Let's not get carried away with that assessment of perfect. I don't think perfect here means perfect in the way we might think of it. But certainly compared to the generation, he stood out. He is someone that, like with the qualifications of an elder, that he is blameless does not mean that he has never sinned, but it does mean that when you make an accusation against him, it just doesn't stick. When he does sin, he doesn't hide it. He confesses it. He does what he can to make recompense for the wrongs he has caused. And so you can't find any skeletons in his closet or any chapters of his life he doesn't want to see the light of day. And that's the idea here with Noah, is that in his generation, well, he really stood out. And again, he walked with God. Who else is said to have walked with God in Genesis? Enoch. Yeah. Yes. Between from Adam to Noah. Oh boy, you could go through the genealogies and add it up. Did anyone do that? I don't have the patience for that. Oh, Megan Kitt? All right, I'll track her down. I don't have the patience for adding up all the numbers. 950 years. 950 years? Okay.
So there wasn't any of Adam's descendants that were good still living?
Doesn't seem like it. And that's one question I have is you notice that after the flood, we don't get people living 700, 800, 900 years anymore, right? Does that kind of bum you out? As a kid, I was like, Methuselah lived 969 years old? That's like as old as Yoda was. And I'd be lucky if I get 100 years. And as a kid, I was obsessed with living that long. Now, I don't think I want to live to be 100. That's another point, though. But I used to think, like, how unfair is that? They got to live for almost a millennia of time. But do you think maybe that's why the world got to where it is? After a couple centuries of life on earth, do you maybe just get tired of walking the straight and narrow? That's where my mind goes, and I think that there's mercy in God reducing our lifespans. If I've only got 60, 70, 80 years, maybe 90 or 100 if I'm really fortunate, I'm going to be a little more mindful in how I spend my time. But if I know, well, Grandpa lived to be 800 years, and I'm only 400 years, I can go a couple more centuries before I get serious about religion. That's the kind of mindset that I think starts to creep in. That's nowhere in the Bible. This is me speculating, but I wonder that out loud, if there's a reason why the lifespan of man greatly is reduced after the flood, and if maybe, just maybe, that's a contributing factor, because you ask a good question. 900 years, I mean, how old did Adam live? Wasn't he about 900 years himself? 930. So, I mean, you think about that, it's like we're not that many generations removed. Almost 1,000 years, but that's not very many generations.
But they were probably like 800 years old before they started Achan and Onan.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, and having those long lifespans, I think, sped up the process of filling the earth. And that is something we've observed already. I think that's an excellent observation and probably a contributing factor in why they lived so long early on. But that's all speculation. So we could ponder that all day long. But I do know that we're looking at around a 100-year span, because we're told that back in chapter 5 that Noah was 500 years old when he started having children, and he's 600 years old when the flood waters start. So we do know that somewhere in this 100-year span is where Noah built the ark. I don't think it took him the full 100 years, but that's the window of time where this story takes place, is between Noah's 500th and 600th years. So,
Do you think that was average time before you had kids, was 500 years?
I don't know. That seems, yeah. We waited 10 years after we got married to have kids. That felt like an eternity. Yeah, it's just, and that's where it's so hard to even just fathom what life was like pre-flood, that we just have to almost take this as poetry and look for the main story and the main themes and not get bogged down in the details, because that's just such a different life than we experience. Matthew. Would Noah have had children before? Could be. Yeah, it only records 3 sons. I think the implication is those would be his only 3 sons, but it doesn't necessarily have to rule out the possibility that he had more sons. Just like we know that Adam and Eve had more kids than Cain, Abel, and Seth, but they're the only 3 mentioned. Or we suspect that at least, but we'll just go with what the Bible says here and leave it open to possibility.
Was their years the same as our years now back then?
I would guess so, but I'm not entirely sure. My assumption is yes, but yeah. Again, in verse 11 of chapter 6, the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So let's just kind of remove that whole idea that God killed all these innocent people. There's not much innocence going around. Okay, so when God takes a life, He's the one that gave the life. He has every right and all authority to do so if that is His judgment. That's what it means to be the creator. The lump of clay can't look back at the potter and say, hey, you can't do this. Make me different. It's not the way it works. He's the creator. We are the created. One interesting point here, though, is in verse 10. Who is the oldest of Noah's 3 sons? Shem. Why do we think that? Because he's listed first. This is hard to prove, but if you go to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 21, this will greatly depend on your translation. If you have the texts like the King James, New King James, versions like that lean into the Textus Receptus and that manuscript route for their translation into English, you're going to get one thing. If you go more towards the majority text that you get, like the New American Standard or the ESV based on, you get a different version here. So it is a matter of dispute among manuscripts. But chapter 10 and verse 21, and children were born also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder. Not every version says it that way. But this leaves the possibility that Japheth was the oldest. This does not matter in the big picture, so don't get too hung up on this. But I'll make a point in just a second. Bob?
Commentary said maybe because Shem ended up being the priestly line.
Yeah. And that's what I think is going on here. So this is a very minor point, but it is something that we see all throughout Genesis. How many times do we follow, not the firstborn, but we follow the story through one of the younger? How many times does that happen in the book of Genesis? Isaac is not the firstborn son of Abraham. It's Ishmael, but we follow Isaac. Jacob or Esau, we follow Jacob. Who was the oldest son of Jacob? Reuben. But we don't really care much about Reuben, do we? No, we skip through Reuben and Simeon and Levi because they all have bad stories, which we'll talk about in the 30s, when we get to the 30s in chapters. We focus on Judah. And then that goes on through beyond Genesis as well. David is not the oldest of the sons of Jesse. Solomon is not the oldest of David's sons. I mean, how many times does this happen? It makes sense to me that this would just be one more example of that, because we know that Shem, that's where you get the people of Israel. They are descendants of Shem. And so it makes sense that even though I can't prove it, even though he may not be the oldest, his name comes first. Even Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh is the oldest, but we say Ephraim and Manasseh. So it just makes sense to me that even though it's a little disputed based on manuscripts, I kind of lean towards this interpretation because that's all over Genesis. So just a completely side point there that is of little relevance, but something that may add some interest to this little verse here, that Shem, even though we think of him as the oldest, he may not have been, but he's the one we trace our main story and main bloodline through, so he gets the preeminence there. So just a little side point there. The world is awful, and God says, I'm going to bring an end to all flesh in verse 13. I'm going to destroy them. So he tells Noah to make an ark. What is an ark, by the way? A boat. What was that? A box. Yeah, what was the Ark of the Covenant? A box. We think of a boat like the picture up there that I happened to put up there. Trick question, I'm sorry. This is a box, a large box. It's not a boat like we typically think of. It wasn't meant to sail anywhere. It was meant to be a box that they would get inside. Just think the Ark of the Covenant. It was a box. That's what this is. And it's just a place, and God gave them specific instructions. There's so much here in chapter 6 that we could spend a lot of time kind of discussing side topics like authority. Just really briefly here, what are some of the things that God says specifically? What are some specific instructions of God? Direct commandments. I'll use the Church of Christ nomenclature here. Commands. What are commands? The size, the material. He gives specific lengths. Gopher wood, that's the materials. Verse 15, 300 cubits in length and 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. What are some implications here? What are some things that are implied? Has to have a window. 3 levels, right? Couldn't be 4, couldn't be 2, had to be 3. He says to make it with rooms, right? How many rooms? At least 2. Right? Kind of like elders. Has to be a plurality if it says rooms, but doesn't specify. So there's just all kinds of things you could delve into. The authority issues, the commands, the examples, the inferences that are there. What did God say? What did God show? What did God imply? There's so much here. But ultimately, God gave instructions, and Noah could have built the boat 200 cubits in length. He could have made it out of cedar instead of gopher wood. Could have made it any way he wanted, but it just wouldn't have floated, would be my guess. It says at the end of this chapter that Noah did according to all that God commanded him, so he did. So let's get back to that question of what saved Noah? Obedience. It says it right there. He obeyed everything. He did everything God told him to do. But what about he found grace? At the beginning of the chapter, in verse 8. Did grace save Noah? Yeah, if God didn't look at Noah and say, you know what, I'm going to tell him to build a boat. If God didn't start out by offering him this chance, none of this would happen. He would have drowned with everybody else. If God didn't decide to give him a warning and give him instructions to build a boat? Where does faith play into this equation? Yeah. Had it ever rained on the earth at this point in mankind's history? Yeah. I'm going to flood the earth with rain. What's rain? Okay, but I'll take your word for it. I'll trust you. Can you take out any one of those three parts of the equation? Grace. It starts with God warning Noah and giving him an opportunity. Then it comes to faith. Will Noah believe what God has warned him about? And that faith is not faith until it produces the obedience. What if Noah had just said, you know, God, I believe you. Thanks for saving me. And then he kicked back and took naps for the next 100 years and didn't get to work. He believed God, but it was not faith that flowed over into action. Then, yeah, maybe he... Yeah. Acknowledging... Yeah. Yeah. And that's what James talks about, that even the demons believe and shudder. So there's belief, but then capital B, belief, which is faith. I don't think you cross that threshold from believe like the demons. I acknowledge the existence of God. I acknowledge that he is who he says he is. But I don't think that crosses the threshold into faith until it's now, like James said, I will show you my faith by my actions. That's the evidence that my faith is fully matured. And now it overflows into actions. And so any one of those three, it's like a triangle. You remove one and the structure falls. So how was Noah saved? By the grace of God, through faith in what God warned him about, he obeyed. All of those work together. But it starts with grace. That is the beginning point. Grace is how he was saved. The flood was the means by which he was saved from the perverse generation. And you know the parallel I'm trying to make here with baptism. Baptism is the means by which we are saved, but it is grace that is the thing that saves us, that is the driving force, like Ephesians 2 talks about. We were dead in our trespasses and sins, but by grace we have been saved. It starts with God, but it must produce an action within us through our faith that overflows into obedience. And we see all of that with Noah. I just think that chapter 6 is just for teaching authority and for teaching the basics of how salvation works. I think Genesis 6 is such a perfect chapter to illustrate those things. Any questions or comments through chapter 6? I am going a little bit quicker because these are children's stories. No, I'm joking. I'm going a little bit quicker here because we do have a little more familiarity with the story of Noah.
There's lots of children in here, so.
There are childlike people for sure. All right, so this is where the story begins. And then chapter 7, as you could probably pick up from my reluctance to count up all the generations from Adam to the flood, I don't like counting and tallying numbers, so I didn't do that in chapter 7, but it's something like a year that the water prevailed on the earth. He was in the ark for more than a year. Ken and Sandy, how long were you guys on your cruise ship when the COVID thing broke out? 33 days. You were probably getting pretty tired of it after 33 days. I mean, that sounds nice for the first week. They just bring you food. You had a balcony. That sounded pretty cool, but I bet it got tired really fast living in that small little quarantine space. Imagine being stuck on a boat for a year. And of course, you could talk all day long. This is the kind of stuff I don't necessarily want to get bogged down with, but this all stuff is really cool. With the length of the ark, the size of it, I forgot to print it out, but to hear the amount of volume that was in the ark by train car, someone broke it down that way. I'll see if I can find that next week. I forgot to print it out tonight. But to just get a size of the scale of the ark, it's incredible how massive this was. Essentially, the whole third upper deck there could have been a lot of open space up there. There was room for more people. but no one else took advantage of it. How could God fit all the animals on there? Those are the kinds of questions people get bogged down on. They were babies. Hibernating makes it easy. That's my answer. But you can speculate all day on that kind of stuff. The simple truth is God made it happen. And the thing I want to emphasize in chapter 7, more so than how he got all the animals on there, were there dinosaurs? Probably, but I don't know. Those aren't the kind of questions that Genesis is interested in telling us. So we're left to speculate those things, and that's fun, but not particularly useful. What is emphasized, though, is chapter 7 and verse 5. Noah did according to all the Lord commanded him. Verse 9, 2 by 2 they went into the ark to Noah, male and female, as God commanded Noah. Verse 16, so those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. Multiple times throughout this chapter, it emphasizes that Noah did what God asked of him. And that's why Noah was saved. He wasn't perfect. He had his faults, and after the flood, one of those faults is forever printed in the pages of the Bible. One of those failures. But when God asked him to do something, he did it. That's the main takeaway in chapter 7 of Noah. For all the questions we might have about how did he accomplish all of this, God wanted it to happen, so God made it happen. But what is emphasized repeatedly is Noah's obedience. You guys have any other questions or comments through chapter 7? That's the time that he is on the ark. The water covers the earth. And they wait and wait and wait and wait. Okay?
Mentioned several times male and female.
Yeah, that's a good point. 2 genders, pretty clear in Genesis. 2 of every kind. The idea is to repopulate. Of course, there were several clean animals that I think there were 7 pairs. Is the way I think that ought to be understood. There were a few kinds of animals where there were 7 pairs, because we see that he offers on an altar some sacrifices after the flood. So there were some extra animals of certain kinds that were clean for sacrifice. And then, of course, chapter 8, you get this the story about the dove with the olive branch in its mouth, and when they knew it was safe to come out of the ark. So having been on there for so long, they finally set down on dry land. And it says in verse 13 of chapter 8 that it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month and the first day of the month, that the waters dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And then a little while later, the earth was dried, and God spoke to Noah, saying, Go out of the ark, you and your wife, your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and cattle, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So this is intended to be a reset. We're starting things over. And then God makes this covenant with mankind. I wanted to focus in. I wanted to go fast through some of these parts that we're a little more familiar with, but I want to slow down here, verses 20 through 22 at the end of chapter 8. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. What is the purpose of that statement in verse 8? In chapter 8, in verse 21, when he says, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. I learned my lesson. There's no fixing man, so I'm just going to stop trying. Is that what God is saying here? What do you make of that statement in verse 21? What does it mean that God would no longer curse the ground? dishonor. Little different take on it. But isn't that exactly what he did in Genesis chapter 3, the initial consequence of sin? Isn't that how he described the way the world was different? The ground is cursed. It brings forth thistles and thorns and things like that. God's not doing that anymore. Yeah. Man is always going to be prone to sin. Man is always going to be subject to temptation. When you're a Christian, when you're baptized, it doesn't mean temptation goes away. In fact, oftentimes it means it intensifies in your life. And you could be on the straight and narrow for years and years and years, and before you know it, you can take a wrong step and get your life way off track in an instant. For all of your years on this earth, you are going to be subject to temptation, and that is always going to be reality, no matter how hard we try. I think that's just something that is stated here. Yeah, Connie.
Is that verse 21 in chapter 8, is it used for people to say that we were born in sin? That their intent was from their youth?
It probably is, but of course it doesn't say anything about guilt. And I think you could easily explain that, as in it doesn't talk about guilt, that you are born guilty, and it doesn't talk about from birth, but from youth, the time when we begin to become self-aware and make decisions for ourselves and become accountable. The age of accountability thing, that mysterious age of accountability that's somewhere in those teenage years. That's a question for another class, though. So I think it could be explained that way. But God cursed the ground in Genesis 3. In Genesis 6, in another sense, he cursed the ground again by causing it to be flooded and eradicating all life on the ground. And God says, I'm not doing that anymore. And that's the promise he makes in verse 22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. He says, I'm not changing that again. I will allow things to continue. And the rest of this story after Noah is about the different approach that God is going to take. A Messiah. A spiritual redeemer. Sin will always be a reality in this world, but through the Messiah, we would find an escape from that guilt. We would find the means to overcome temptation and find forgiveness when we do sin. So that's kind of the change I see. I don't know, did you guys see anything different in those last couple verses of chapter 8? It's kind of a head scratcher at first, but it also makes sense to me when I think about it in those terms, that the first couple stories in Genesis are about sin and the consequences being severe and affecting just the very nature of this world. And God says, that I'm done with that after the flood. I'm not going to do that anymore. That's the promise I make to you. And of course, in the next chapter, what's the sign of this covenant? Rainbow. Who is that for? What's that? It's for everybody. Kind of a trick question. It is for everybody. We see it, and we always think of the flood when we see the rainbow in the sky. But God also says it's for me when I see it. What is the significance of the rainbow? What does it represent when God says, I will put my bow in the sky? It is a promise, but I think there's a direct symbol behind it as well. A promise to what?
It's all the colors.
Not to destroy the earth.
And he's going to accept everything. I mean, it's not just, the Jews are not going to be the only people that he takes. It's the color of the world.
I could see that, especially in our Revelation class, that in the throne of God, you see it as surrounded by rainbow. I could see that interpretation as well. But I think there's also a very simple visual metaphor. It's his war bow. I'm hanging it up. And there it is in the sky. I'm not fighting. You are not the enemy anymore. I am not making war against the world anymore. So I will put my bow up in the sky. I think that's the visual metaphor he talks about when he says, I will put my bow in the sky. Saying, not flood the earth again. That He will still judge sin, and there have been consequences for sin all throughout man's history, but God will not make war against the world in that sense. And specifically, he mentions by flooding it.
Idea of him not cursing the ground, part of what he says there, I'm not going to curse the ground on account of man. And so it's kind of
Yeah.
indicates, you know, if man sins, that's not going to be the consequence.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, because he did that in Genesis 3 and again in Genesis 6. And so that's a good point to make there, that because on account of man's sin, for man's sake, as a consequence for man's sin. This is not how he's going to do things anymore after this point. Yes?
When I see a rainbow, whenever I see a rainbow, I automatically think of God and his promises and how he cares about us.
Yeah. And so it works both ways, that we see it and it means something to us. Not that God would forget, but he does say that I'll put it up there, and when I see it, I will remember. But it's more for us, even though he words it as in, I will see it, but that's more to reassure us that God made a promise and he's going to stick to it. And that is reassuring. And so it is cool to see rainbows, and it's one of the simplest things we teach our kids as a reminder, a visual representation of God's faithfulness that's everywhere around us. So chapter 9, God blessed Noah and his sons and told them to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth. Now things are going to change. Looks like meat's back on the menu. They were vegetarians at first, but now he says you can eat animals. But there is a provision, though. In verse 3, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. So if you're a vegetarian for dietary reasons, that's fine. You live your life, but if you have moral reasons for it, Genesis 9:3, I got that right there. Also, the angel told Peter to arise, kill, and eat in Acts chapter 10. But that's beside the point. That's not the axe to grind tonight. But he says here in verse 4, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Here's a provision. Why? Why is it important not to eat the blood? The life is in the blood? Is that what you said, Bill? Yeah. There is significance to it. Belongs to the Lord. Yeah, there's a lot of significance and symbolism to the blood. But there is another reason specifically given here. Reading in verse 5. Surely your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning for your lifeblood. From the hand of every beast I will require it, from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. And as for you, be fruitful, multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth, and multiply in it. So, verse 6, what is the purpose statement for all these instructions? For, because, why? In the image of God. Are we the only ones that are eating other animals? Other animals eat other animals. What does it look like when a lion eats a zebra? He's hungry. It's messy. It's bloody. Doesn't drain the blood first. Yeah, we are made in God's image. I think that's the simple answer there for why we're told don't eat the blood. Animals do that because they're not made in God's image. You're not an animal. You eat other animals now just like the predators do. But you're not one of them. You're not an animal. So be civilized. Drain the blood and cook your food because you're different from the animals. That's the connection I see when he gives that purpose statement. For in the image of God he made man. And it's also related to this idea of whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. You know, I try not to get political in Bible classes. And I know it's a contentious thing, especially in some parts of the country, about the death penalty and things like that. But from a Christian standpoint, I don't think you can make the case that the Bible is against the death penalty. I think this is a pretty plain, outspoken truth here. God says, when you shed man's blood, you took something that was not your right to take, and that forfeits your life. Seems very cut and dry to me. Now, I get that there are checks and balances, and that if there's doubt, if there's reasonable doubt, if there's not sufficient evidence, I'm certainly not saying we just kill everyone that's suspected of murder. But to argue from a Christian standpoint that the Bible is all about love and do no harm, and the death penalty is murder and we shouldn't be, no. I think this is a very plain statement of truth in the Bible. And God says not because it's going to curb violence or stop more murder from happening. He says, no, it's simply right because that person is made in the image of God. And they did something and took something that they had no right to take. So we can pick up there if you had any more questions or comments on that. But we'll look at the rest of Genesis chapter 9 and the rest of the story of Noah. Takes a dark turn at the end of chapter 9.